Interestingly, the ACT Party in its newsletter, The Free Press, which puts out regularly, has made a commentary around the presidency. They're picking that Donald Trump will win, and in their commentary they're saying he's going to be a lot angrier.
Slightly less controversial, but it's been a bad month for him. He was first quoted in the media for saying he wanted to keep employees captive in the office and not let them out for coffee breaks. I reported that in Shoeshine this week, actually. But then it's been revealed that Ellison spent a decade running a tax evasion scheme.
So it's a large amount for a casual employee that was essentially only employed for, I think, around 8 weeks. So yeah.
An expensive lesson.
Business groups say these changes are anti-business. They'll say they'll add to costs and inflation, and they'll make them cut jobs, not add jobs. And so they say Australia just can't afford these changes at the moment.
It's a devastating issue that you can't have a Christmas dinner, you can't have a glass of wine with your friends at the end of the day. If you take away food, you take away more than nutrition and hydration. You take away a huge part of quality of life and engagement with people.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, with the US election shaping up to be a dead heat next week, I spoke with our political editor Brent Edwards to ask what a Trump or Harris presidency mean for New Zealand. Next week's US presidential election has significant implications for New Zealand and other countries around the world. The polls seem to be neck and neck. At this stage, is that a surprise?
Yeah, well, I think for some people it is. You know, people would expect that the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, given his past history, given his rhetoric, his language, and it's clear lying, that he wouldn't be close to this. I think, as some American commentators said to me, in New Zealand you probably wouldn't have a candidate who would get up in that way. So in that sense, but on the other hand, though, he's got a policy around tax cuts and the imposition of tariffs, which does resonate with a lot of American voters, particularly, sort of middle Americans who feel squashed by cost of living and basically blame imports for them losing their jobs. So, he's got a policy sort of agenda which does attract votes.
What are New Zealanders saying? You've been speaking to some people?
Oh, yeah, look, here in New Zealand, so in terms of what it might mean for New Zealand, the sense is, and for other countries too, really, is that the sense is that a Trump presidency would be more difficult because he is just seen as much more unpredictable and volatile. And certainly there's a sense, that if he pushes ahead with the 20% tariffs, of course, that would have quite an impact on New Zealand's trade. But it's seen likely that he might be perhaps even more antagonistic to China, although whether it's him or Kamala Harris, that kind of tension, American tension with China is going to continue, and that is also going to raise some issues for New Zealand in terms of particularly our trading relationship with China, but our security and political relationship with the United States. So it does raise a lot of questions, but I think the general sense from talking to people is that a Trump presidency would be perhaps more difficult, as David Capey from the Centre for Strategic Studies says. Trump's likely to give a lot of Asian leaders sleepless nights.
Are politicians saying anything here?
Look, politicians, don't want to comment on another country's election, and they clearly don't want to comment and make comments that might be critical and then find that, okay, the person that they might have criticised is now president. But interestingly, the ACT Party in its newsletter, The Free Press, which puts out regularly, has made a commentary around the presidency. They're picking that Donald Trump will win, and in their commentary they're saying he's going to be a lot angrier than what he was in his first term as president, but he'll also know a lot more about what to do as president. They don't believe he'll impose the 20% tariffs because obviously cost of living is a big issue that he's campaigned on as well, and that will help push up costs but it'll be interesting to see. On the other hand, Stephen Jacoby, trade expert, says, he said he'd pull out of the TPP the last time he became president, and he did. So at the moment, you've got to take him at his word that he would impose 20% tariffs.
Any advice for the New Zealand government then?
Well, the advice from New Zealand, I suppose, if you think back to when Trump won the presidency, and it pretty much dovetailed with Labor being in government and Jacinda Ardern being Prime Minister, and she was seen almost as the antithesis of Trump. And there wasn't a lot of, I guess, there was certainly no close relationship at that kind of very senior leadership level. But David Cabey says, that the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, really, you'd have to be pragmatic. And while we might, or the government might be concerned about some of the rhetoric of Donald Trump, having a good relationship with the United States is important. And that means having a good relationship at the leadership level, if you can get it. I mean, because obviously, all New Zealand Prime Ministers, we're well down the pecking order when it comes to getting a visit to the White House. So, whether that would occur or not, whether Trump's president or Harris's president, is always an open question.
You've talked about trade and tariffs. Are there any other concerns, things on people's minds?
Well, the big issue is obviously around security, and there also the expectation possibly that more pressure would go on American allies and friends, which would include New Zealand, to up their spending on defence, because Trump very much has this view that America carries the cost of, say, defending Europe, that NATO's not doing its share. But I think if it looked into the Asia Pacific region, he'd probably have the same sense about other countries here. So, that would probably put more pressure out on New Zealand around defence spending and defence, but also just the whole security aspect around if those conflict, or if that tension escalates, that's just going to make things more difficult. And that then flows on to trade too, because if New Zealand, for instance, is seen as too close to the United States, which is being more, if you like, confrontational with China, then does China react in terms of its trade relationship with New Zealand? So there's a whole lot of interconnected issues there. You don't quite know how they'll work out, but certainly, it's going to be more complicated.
In this week's Underarm column, Australian correspondent Lachlan Cahoon and co-editor Hamish McNichol discuss what happens when Aussie billionaires misbehave badly, thus creating problems for investors.
Elon Musk is a controversial and polarising figure, and many people see his behaviour as increasingly erratic. Musk, however, isn't the only example of someone who has founded a successful business only to run into controversy when their private behaviour collides with the obligations of being a publicly listed company. Lachlan, why don't we start with who exactly these billionaires behaving badly are?
Yeah, Hamish, so they're Richard White and Chris Ellison. They're two of Australia's richest people. Let's start with White first. He is the founder of ASX-listed Swaltech. It's a logistics software company. He personally is worth around $10 billion. Chris Ellison, he's originally a Kiwi from Dunedin. He made his fortune in WA Minerals. He founded a company called Mineral Resources, which is iron ore and lithium mining. He's worth about $2.5 billion. Both are examples of privately founded companies, which then went public, and both founders are now CEOs, or one of them is no longer the CEO. We'll get to that in a moment. But they also retain significant equity stakes, and they've been in the media big time in the last couple of weeks for very sort of sensational and erratic behaviour.
Richard White's perhaps the most sensational, the most explosive out of the two. What exactly has been happening there?
This is one of those stories. It's so good you couldn't make it up. White, he was started as a guitar tech for AC/DC, the rock band. He himself played in a glam rock band in the 70s, and then moved into doing the media for tech events. And then he moved into logistics software, and he founded Swaltech 30 years ago. The company is worth around $36 billion now. But his private life has intruded significantly. It came to light when a former lover and business partner, there was dispute over $90,000 worth of furniture that she purchased for a $13 million house that he allegedly bought for her and her children to live in. And the relationship ended when White's wife found out about this relationship, and he called the relationship with this woman off. She then garnished $90,000 from his personal bank account, and then he took her to court and tried to bankrupt her. And so, as this was being played out in the courts, all these other cases came to light. In 2018, he bought another Sydney house for $4.8 million for another woman that he was involved with, and previous to that, purchased a house in Melbourne worth $7 million for another lover. He was known as the LinkedIn Lecher for befriending women over the careers platform and talking to them and talking them up and then getting personal in his conversations with them. And there was also a controversy over a $2.7 million salary, double White's own salary that he paid to a former female executive who was the chief growth officer at Swaltech, and the investors weren't informed about her salary at all.
Wow. Okay. Chris Ellison on the other side, you can't possibly live up to that.
Slightly less controversial, but it's been a bad month for him. He was first quoted in the media for saying he wanted to keep employees captive in the office and not let them out for coffee breaks. I reported that in Shoeshine this week, actually. But then it's been revealed that Ellison spent a decade running a tax evasion scheme. He and a couple of other founding executives, Mineral Resources, formed a company in the British Virgin Islands which sold mining equipment to Mineral Resources at vastly inflated prices. So they were pocketing the profits on those sales, while Mineral Resources were claiming tax deductions on that. So Ellison did report this to the Australian Taxation Office several years ago. He's described it as a serious lapse of judgment, but it's just come out in the media over the last week, and he's copping a lot for that.
So two very high-profile, attention-grabbing issues here, but they're quite different as well. How are the two companies dealing with each of these issues?
Well, at Swaltech, White has been ousted as chief executive. That happened late last week. But he has been retained as a consultant to the company on exactly the same $1 million a year salary that he was on as chief executive. So you could argue that not a lot has changed. So that's he's going to be on that salary in that position as a consultant for 10 years, and he's just about to turn 70. So you'd see that would probably see him through. He retains about 35% of the company, so you could argue that not a lot's going to really change there. Ellison. Originally, the board said that this was a private tax matter and it didn't have anything to do with investors. Investors disagreed. Some of Australia's largest superannuation funds are investors in Mineral Resources, and they're kicking up a bit of a stink about this, with the result that the board has tasked a legal firm to investigate Ellison's tax dealings, and they're due to report next week. So we'll have more on that story next week, Hamish.
And you can read more from Lachlan on that at mbr.co.nz. A recent Employment Relations Authority case involving a family-owned funeral home has revealed you can be too casual about hiring staff on a casual basis. Legal Vision Senior Associate Ruby Hollinshead speaks with Fiona Rotherham.
In Toil and Trouble this week, we look at an interesting case around a casual employee who was dismissed after just 3 weeks of working for a funeral home. Haven Falls is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation and therefore requires significant commitment to the provided roster. And joining me now to discuss the case is Ruby Hollinshead, a Senior Associate with Legal Vision. Welcome, Ruby.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a bit about the background to this ERA case.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, as you've highlighted. And I think the really key interesting point really is that it is generally known under a casual agreement that there is no expectation of ongoing employment. Therefore, employers can just no longer offer shifts. However, this case really did highlight that that's not the case when there's been some sort of agreement to have an engagement that's ongoing for a period of time. And that if you do dismiss an employee sort of during that period of engagement, you could be looking at an issue similar to this case, where essentially you could be liable for unjustified dismissal.
So it was really around the fact that they'd had promised ongoing training, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that sort of, in terms of background, the employee was hired on the casual arrangement, and the authority actually did go through in the determination looking at whether they were in fact permanent. That was not found to be in favour of the employee, so the authority was comfortable that they were in fact casual. However, because they were offered, I think it was an 8-week training period, and during that time, the employer did have some issues with performance and decided to not continue that employment, which normally is okay. However, because there was that ongoing expectation, the authority ultimately found that the employee was unjustifiably dismissed, and that could come as a shock to a lot of employers, particularly because that is a general knowledge that you can just stop offering shifts, but not in this case.
What was the outcome? What was the penalty, so to speak?
Yes. In terms of, so the employee was awarded, I think it was the 4 weeks wages that they had have been entitled to. And one point that was quite interesting in the case is they definitely, the authority found that there was no need to go over and above that because it was very unlikely that the employment would have continued past that additional 4 weeks because of the concerns they had. And then I believe it was $20,000 for gross for hurt and humiliation. And yeah, so I think around a total of around $30,000 so it's a large amount for a casual employee that was essentially only employed for I think around 8 weeks. So yeah,
an expensive lesson. What is the lesson for other employees then that are wanting to use casual workers? What should they look out for then?
Just looking out for that. If you are going to have a casual employee that has agreed shifts for an ongoing period, say, it's just bringing that caution to if you are going to terminate during that time that you will need to have a fair and proper process to do so. So really looking out for any ongoing expectation that goes over and above those usually, daily, weekly offered shifts. So just to keep that in mind, otherwise you could be looking at something similar to this case. What
is the legal definition then of casual?
There's no actual legal definition in the Act, but it's generally, which can be, it's a bit odd really, but it's essentially that there's just no ongoing expectation of employment. So I think what you should be looking at is obviously really that, is there an ongoing expectation? Is there a set, and then they can look to whether there's set days, set hours. Obviously, a lot of the time with casual employment relationships, they can turn permanent by nature because of the employee coming in every day, no longer having to be offered work. And similarly, they feel like they can't turn down work. So it's just very important. I think the advice for employers would always be just to check, okay, are we actually offering them shifts? Can they say no? And if that's the case, then it should be okay. But if it's that ongoing expectation where they're turning up every single day, and we get that a lot, it sort of actually has that now turned permanent because that's an ongoing expectation.
And what's the difference between the two then? What changes when it moves from casual to permanent?
To permanent. So permanent employees have that, I guess it's more of that security because in order to dismiss them, you need to follow a fair and proper process. So with casual, there are benefits for the employee and the employer, but the main one essentially, and I think this case is sort of where it's showing here, is usually if you don't want to carry on the employment, you can just stop offering work. Whereas with a permanent employee, they're guaranteed work, they have a set number of hours, and to terminate their employment, you need to go through a proper process. And you can't just say, look, you're not coming in tomorrow, we don't have any more work for you. That doesn't work with a permanent employee. So it's always good for employers that have casual employees, and we say it often, is to keep that real eye on what the true nature of that relationship actually is. And that way you won't get yourself caught out. And you can always move to the permanent employment if you need to, but it's making sure you're aware of what's actually happening.
With the gig economy, have you noticed a rise in the use of casual workers?
Look, I think yes and no. I think the 90-day trial has enabled people to want to stay permanent, which is a benefit, because you do have that ability to terminate within that first 90 days. Although in saying that can come with a whole nother raft of potential risk for employers. But casual is great when it's intended for what it's meant to be. So when it is really just a casual relationship and it works really well, in a lot of industries that does work. And your hospitality industries, that's really common. And in particular where maybe someone works for more than just one employer, sometimes that's appropriate too. So it can depend, but I think the 90-day trial has helped that people take a leap of faith with that 90-day and having someone permanent as opposed to casual.
Former Qantas Chief Executive Alan Joyce reckoned the airline could save about 100 million Australian dollars a year by outsourcing 1,700 below-wing ground handling jobs. So he sacked the workforce. Now Qantas has been ordered to pay 170,000 Australian dollars to 3 of the workers in what is a test case for the full cohort. Stick around for more on this developing story.
Industrial relations is always a hot-button issue as employers look to limit costs and maximise flexibility, and employees protect their entitlements. Lachlan, can you start by telling us about the Qantas case?
For sure, Calendar. I mean, it happened during the height of the pandemic when Alan Joyce and Qantas, they sacked 1,700 ground staff. These were below wing workers. And so Joyce wanted to outsource these jobs. He said it would save the company around $100 million a year. And after that, the Transport Workers Union took action went to the High Court. The High Court said the sackings were illegal, and they handed down the penalty last week for 3 workers. It was a test case. Those 3 workers will get about $170,000 between them. So across the 1,700 workers, Qantas is looking at paying $100 million. But that's what Joyce said they'd save in 1 year. So if you look at it over 10 years, the Qantas would save $1 billion, and they're paying a $100 million fine. So the fine might not be such a penalty for them after all.
So what have been the trends in the labour market in Australia?
We've had a significant decline in union membership over the last few decades. In the 1980s, about 40% of all workers were in unions. That is only now just over 10%. The number of industrial disputes we're having is much, much lower. I had a look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In 1985, for example, in 1 month, in March, there were 445 disputes involving 132,000 workers. The ABS figures show that in June this year, there were 52 disputes and 23,000 workers were involved. So that's a huge reduction. We have a very casualised workforce. More than 20% of people are casual employees. And we have the rise of what we call sole traders here. These are people who essentially run a business of one. They don't earn enough money to pay the goods and services tax and often run a portfolio of businesses working for a number of employers, and there are now over 1 million of these sole traders in the economy.
So what have been the changes to labour laws which are causing such a fuss?
Well, remember that Labor came to power in 2022 after 10 years of coalition government, and that period also saw big changes in the labour force, the rise of the gig economy. So they introduced this, what they call the close the loophole legislation, which creates a pathway to permanency for casual employees. And it's divided between small businesses. If a business has 15 or less employees, then a person can move to permanency after 1 year. For larger businesses, it's 6 months. And so it also tackles the gig economy, where those workers are treated as independent contractors and don't get superannuation, sick leave or holidays. It gives them what they call employee-like status, so they can become employees and get those entitlements. Perhaps the most controversial side of it is what they call the right to disconnect laws. It means that employees can ignore phone calls and emails from their employers after hours if they don't really want to hear from them. Business groups say these changes are anti-business. They'll say they'll add to costs and inflation, and they'll make them cut jobs, not add jobs. And so they say Australia just can't afford these changes at the moment.
So what about labour productivity? How's Australia scoring on that at the moment?
Well, this is the point that business is making, and they say that, okay, well, we can come at these entitlements for labour if they're being more productive, but by any measure they are not. The Australian labour force is not more productive. We are ranked 14 out of 18 by the OECD for productivity. New Zealand is in 11th place, by the way. Our Productivity Commission said our productivity was below average in 2023, but typical over the last 5 years. So it's not improving. At the same time, wages are up 4% in the last year, but that's being eaten up by inflation. But I think also it's worth mentioning that corporate profits in the 3 years to 2022 are up 43%. So the share of profits going to GDP is increasing significantly, while that to labour is down. But it's a delicate balance between labour and employers. The government's trying to redress the balance, but the employers are pushing back, and it's going to be a big election issue when we go to the polls next year.
And finally this week, distinguished Professor Maggie Lee Huckabee is commercialising software that measures muscle activity for patients that struggle to swallow. Fiona Rotherham with this.
Swallowing Technologies is a commercialisation arm for health technology developed at the University of Canterbury Rose Centre for Stroke Recovery and Research. And joining me now to talk about the innovative technology is Professor Huckabee and the company's CEO, Emma Hayes. Well, welcome to you both. Can we talk a bit about the research that Swaltech is focused on?
Yeah, I think our main focus is a rehabilitation research tool that we have learned over the years of research that swallowing is not necessarily a reflex, as most people would assume, but there's a lot of cortical control over the way that you swallow. So we've captured that cortical control using EMG or electromyography as a biofeedback device. Then the patient essentially can change the way they swallow by changing the way a line moves on the screen. Based on feedback from clinicians, we developed the device so that patients take it home and can do home training 2 or 3 times a day, every single day, which is not available to patients coming in through outpatient clinics. So our healthcare resources don't allow for intensive training, but we know that intensive training is best. So this product was intended to be used by patients in their home environment doing the intensive swallowing rehabilitation that they need.
So you were doing this research at the Rose Centre and then decided you wanted to spin it out in order to get it into people's hands?
Yes, that's correct. So the Rose Center is a clinical research facility. We have clinics that are set up, but we also have a very active research arm. And we've been looking at the issues surrounding cortical control of swallowing for quite some time and developed a precursor to the current product to use as a research tool. So based on clinician feedback from that, we decided it might be worth it to take the leap into commercialization, in large part so that we can make the research that we do within the ivory tower available to people in the clinical community. We're trying to really focus on that translation of research from the lab to the clinic.
Emma, what's the commercialisation plan then?
Yeah, well, we started off ambitious and we've now become more focused. So there's multiple things involved in that. So the first bit, which is really important and often neglected, but is actually what's the regulatory and quality plan? What do we need to do to actually be able to legally sell? So our initial focus within the next 12 months, now that we've got technology ready, is to focus on making it available in Australia and New Zealand. And then from there, take our learnings and replicate that in other markets. So after that, we'll aim to go to the US and then the UK and Europe after that. We're navigating a little bit around the reimbursement process. What every country is a little bit different. And as we understand right now, things are challenging within New Zealand. So in the next 12 months, our focus really is about building credibility around the product, the company, and validating the product, so getting it into the hands of users and finding good partners within industry.
So have you had a lot of interest from clinicians?
Oh boy, yes. Yeah, we really have. It helps that we've got Maggie Lee in our corner. Her reputation is known worldwide, so it certainly helps us open a lot of doors and start having those conversations. However, what we are trying to do is influence a change in practice. So that's going to take a lot of changing around thinking and how things are done. So we've got, I wouldn't say an uphill battle, but certainly we've got a challenge around that. So our focus in the next 6 to 12 months is really about getting people using it in the way that it's intended rather than doing things like they've always been done. And then for people then to see the impact of that change, both to the quality of life of their patients, but actually economically as well.
What support have you had from within New Zealand for setting up a company like this?
When we started this, I have no experience in commercialization, and I will be the first to admit that I do not have a business brain, which is why we needed a good co-founder, Steve Wakefield, and a good CEO to rally that part. Very early on, the University of Canterbury Research and Innovation Office supported me to get KiwiNet funding. So we got a KiwiNet Tier 2 fund grant to start the development of the product. And then I think that since that point in time, there really is a very strong ecosystem within New Zealand and very specifically within Christchurch as well for startup companies to get support. So I think that we have taken very full advantage of what's available to us in terms of getting funding and options that Emma, of course, knows more about all of those steps that we've gone through to get that. But from the start, I have felt very well supported in getting this off the ground. I think somebody didn't tell me when I started this how much work it was going to be and how little I was going to sleep over the last couple of years. And that's probably a very good thing that they didn't tell me that. It has been an enormous amount of work on top of my university position. But I'm also very confident that the dividends of that for me, in terms of seeing a change in clinical work, is going to be absolutely worth it.
Yeah, so then I suppose just to tag on to that in more specifics, I suppose we've engaged quite heavily within Callahan Innovation, who have been very valuable through the Health Tech Activator. They took us on a program called Know Your Market, Know Your Customer, where we did a lot of market validation that was really valuable. We've got access to co-funding, elements of our project or our R&D project, as well as now looking to investigate getting non-R&D funding to help with some of the stuff that sits outside of that, the market validation. So Callahan have been really wonderful.
And how hard was it getting support from outside external investors?
Yeah, well, Maggie Lee started that journey, so getting support from external investors. How hard was that?
You know, I have to say that the Rose Center is largely funded through philanthropic donations. And following on from that, since it's technology coming out of the Rose Center that has formed the first product for Swaltech, many of our donors who supported us philanthropically have come on board as investors. We have sought out external investment and have found that because we were pre-market at that point, it was very hard to get investors from the venture capital groups, for example, and many of the angel groups. So our entire investment has come from the good hearts of local Cantabrians who want to see us succeed. And that has been... Boy, we've got one or two investors that are powerhouses at bending arms backwards and getting people to reach deep in pockets. And so it's been a real pleasure to watch people come to the fore and support us in this.
So what's the point of difference, or how does your treatment improve things for people with this, suffering from this problem?
When people can't eat or drink safely, so swallowing impairment, people try to eat and drink and the food gets in their lungs and doesn't get into their stomach. And then they get chest infection, and a large number of people with chest infection won't survive that event. So in terms of the effect on people, if I told you today you will never eat again, it's a devastating issue that you can't have a Christmas dinner, you can't have a glass of wine with your friends at the end of the day. If you take away food, you take away more than nutrition and hydration. You take away a huge part of quality of life and engagement with people. On top of that, not only does this technology have very great potential to change the health and well-being of patients, but also our New Zealand economy, that we've recently had a PhD student in health economics do some work for us. And in 2023, the attributable cost of swallowing impairment to the New Zealand economy was $110 million in 1 year. And so we've got this challenge that Emma spoke of earlier, where we're working primarily with allied health professionals. Speech and language therapists are the one that provide treatment to patients with swallowing impairment. They are historically underfunded. It's the people in the healthcare sector that struggle to get pens and papers. So we have an underfunded sector that we're reaching out to, but we have a product that has the potential to save the New Zealand government, the New Zealand taxpayer, enormous amounts of money. A chest infection increases hospital costs by 40%. A feeding tube, which is the alternative, they can't eat and drink, costs about $35,000 per year for one individual. It's a huge amount of money, huge amount of money. And so I think that what we're doing is we're trying to put a dent in the way people think. And just because speech swallowing is supported by speech and language therapists does not mean it's not deserving of funding, because it addresses a real health issue.
So, Emma, have you looked at what the sort of total addressable market is globally?
Oh, we have looked at that. Yes, yes. So in terms of the total addressable market, we're seeing that there's 1.2 million new patients in our key regions every year, and that's just looking at stroke and Parkinson's disease. And if you were to, they're not the only groups that would experience dysphagia. You have stroke, Parkinson's disease, pediatric dementia, head and neck cancer, traumatic brain injury. The list goes on, but that's just based on the data that we have available.
Do you have a pipeline of products in, or?
We are working on other products within the Rose Center, and Swaltech has first right of refusal for technology that develops out of the Rose Center. But of course, research and development takes time, and we are working on it. Certainly, if we had greater funding, we would be working on it faster. But we have to work within the confines of funding available.
So just what sort of things is the Rose Centre working on?
Well, without saying too much, we are working on a product that will help us predict at bedside who is more likely to get a chest infection. We know some people can get a lot of food in their lungs and never get sick. Other people get a drop and they wind up with a raging pneumonia. It's very hard to predict who will get sick. So we're looking at developing something that, using machine learning, will help us predict who's going to get unwell based on what we see at bedside. We have another app that we've developed, and that's just about ready to go as soon as we have room in Swaltech to take it on. But we've developed an app that supports a clinical test that patients use at bedside. And then we're looking at another method that will measure essentially closure of the throat during swallowing, that currently we can only measure that either with X-ray, which requires radiation exposure, or with a technique called manometry, where you have to put a tube in the nose and through the throat. So it's not a very comfortable procedure if we want to use that as a biofeedback device. So we have things down the pipeline. We just need to get enough PhD students through so that we have data on those things.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join Mike McRoberts from 5:30 tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. Mā te wā. See you next week.